So we're going to actually look at one of the other barriers and huge challenges to actually supporting people. I won't use the word allowing people, I'll use the word supporting people to make decisions about their own lives. And this is a huge challenge to families, and it's a huge challenge to professionals. And that is around working with risk. In working with risk, we're allowing people or supporting people in doing things that may put our jobs, let's face it, at risk, that may make it difficult for us to account for our actions. But we need to make sure that we have a process so that we're not actually putting people at risk, but we're using risk assessment as an enabling tool that actually encourages people to take risks rather than stops people taking risks. So risk assessment should identify all the measures that are required to minimize risks and to protect staff, service users and tenants and others in terms of taking risks. So what we're actually requiring to do here is that we're requiring to demonstrate that we have considered the risk. So in order to carry out a risk assessment, we have to look at the required planning that needs to go into place to reduce the risk, organisational controls that are already in place that reduce risk, the monitoring and review process, so how do we make sure that our assessment of that risk is still current, and also preventative measures that can be put in place to stop things going wrong in order to enable people to take risks. And we have to also consider recording those things, that we have the records. When I'm training people on risk assessment, I always say to them, imagine you're in a court of law and you've enabled somebody to do something and it all goes wrong. And somebody's going to sue you or take criminal action against you because you were the person that made the decision that this person could do that thing. And imagine you're in that court of law. Well, what do you need behind you to say when you're being cross-questioned? Yes, I made that decision. And yes, I'm comfortable with the decision I made. Now, this is the whole risk assessment process. And it looks at what you need in place behind you to enable people to take the risks in their lives. Now, we all take risks all the time. I'm sure we do. Everyone takes risks with their lives. Unfortunately, for people with disability, and certainly people with autism, oftentimes there are other people that have to take accountability for those risks, and that's either going to be family or friends. So we have to consider this as an important part of empowering people and allowing opportunities to happen for them to get the best out of their lives, rather than blocking them because of the risks. So risk assessment forms must be completed by people who are competent in risk assessment and in the identification of preventative measures. They should not be completed in isolation. So people should actually take a team approach to risk assessment, even if it's just shared with another person as a dynamic risk assessment. 2 heads are better than 1 when you're looking at risks. Completed forms should always be signed off by somebody like a line manager or somebody who's able to take accountability and authorize the taking of that risk. Now, having worked in different services for people with autism over many, many years, I can now tell you that it's a very risky business and people take risks all the time. We are there to enable people to take those risks. So risk assessment becomes a really integral part of allowing people with autism spectrum conditions to lead fulfilled lives. I've had situations brought to me by staff who are saying, oh, can we allow this young person to do this or that? Can we allow that to happen? This is what they want to do, and there's these risks. And I've always said to the person, to the staff, show me your risk assessment. Go away and do your risk assessment, come back and inform me as to what the risks are and what you've put in place to reduce those risks. Therefore, if I find myself in the court of law, I can evidence that I've thought through a process. I can evidence that I've considered the risk, I've acknowledged the risk, and I've thought, yes, I can reduce the risk by putting this, this, and this in place. So staff have a responsibility to ensure that suitable and sufficient risk assessments are carried out. When you're planning support activities, or where risks are posed or in place, risks towards staff, towards service users, and anybody that's affected by those activities. And any doubt that you have in terms of whether something should happen or not is raised over the consequence of actions. So if you have doubts, you have to be able to bring your doubt level down before actions start to happen. Or where there's evidence that a dangerous occurrence has or could happen. Now, if you're working again with people with an autism spectrum condition who may have bizarre or severe or self-injurious behaviours, of course you have to consider risks when they're getting involved in activities. What are the risks to themselves, to others, to the community around them of allowing this to happen? Of course we have to think of those things, but we have a process for reducing that risk and acknowledging it. Or we have to look at where risks cease to be valid. So the risk is now, it's not there. Or there's a significant change in circumstances which changes the risk, whether the risk is now higher or whether the risk is now lower than it was before. So regular reviewing of risk assessments is equally important. So a risk assessment form should assess the activity that we're getting involved in, the name of the person to which it applies. We usually put a reference number on the form that'll begin with the person's initials, so we're keeping it as confidential as we can, and then number those in numerical order. And the assessor will support staff in completing risk assessments in consultation with all the people who are actually involved in that risk or are consulted about that particular risk. And this may well be an offshoot of a person-centred planning meeting. There should always be a review date because risks do change. So we should be actually putting a review date on the risk assessment to say this is when unless anything else happens in between, this is when we're going to come back and consider that risk. And also look at the hazards. So this is what could go wrong. These are the real risks and the effect, which is the result of something going wrong. So if we're looking at something going wrong, on the forms, we're going to look at the effect being low, medium, or high. And in terms of low, it might cause trivial or minor injury. Medium is causing major injury to one or more people. A high risk is causing death to one or more people. And when you think about it, allowing people to do the things they want to do, some of the things that any of us might want to do could end in death. If we dive into a swimming pool at the wrong end and we crash our heads on the lower end of a swimming pool, we've taken the risk of diving in. We haven't done our homework. We've dived, and we might have spinal injuries or we might end up with a fatality. These are risks that we take all the time. The probability of the risk is how likely is that going to happen? How likely is it that that thing will happen? Low, medium, or high? So if it's low, it's not that likely to happen. It may do if there's a hurricane or a tornado hits, but in general day-to-day life, that's very unlikely to happen. In terms of medium, well, yeah, it may happen, could happen. It's not likely to happen, but it could happen. And in terms of high, it's frequent to high occurrence. So we're looking at, actually, we can pretty much guarantee that this will happen at some stage. So we have to consider the effect, and we have to consider the probability when we're considering risks. And then the calculation is made by multiplying the effect and the probability scores. So low times low is low, low times medium is median, low times high is median, average times average is average, and so on and so forth. Now, how does that actually look in practice? What we're wanting to do is to minimize the risk to enable people to do the things they want to do. So in consultation with others, and that might be family, it might be the individual, it might be other professionals, ideas should be found that will reduce the risk. Then we need to determine what is the new level of risk. Having put those ideas and processes in place that we believe would reduce the risk and bring it from a high to a medium, what is the risk now? Where are we at? Low, medium, or high? The residual risk is the risk after all the precautions have been taken. So ideally, that residual risk will be a 0, but a low score will be acceptable in many cases. Now, one little story that you might be interested in terms of one risk assessment I had to get involved in. And I had a young man who was autistic with severe behavioural issues, and he was taken on holiday by 2 staff. He was about 22, this young man. And 2 staff took him away on holiday. They'd taken him to an airfield nearby and to watch the small aircraft, and he loved it. He absolutely loved watching these light aircraft taking off and landing. And he wanted to go in and have a closer look. So they asked permission, they took him on to the airport, and they got talking to a pilot there. And they said, you know what, he just loves these aircraft. He's smiling the whole time. He's so happy when he sees the aircraft taking off and landing. And the pilot said, well, why don't you take him up? I'll take him up for a ride. Okay, now this autistic young man was aversive to lights. Okay, aversive to lights. How many lights are there on the dashboard of an airplane? One of his behaviours was pulling people's hair. So he was likely to grab somebody's hair and pull it. Okay? But the pilot said to the staff, look, what we can do is, and the staff said, but. He said, look, it's a 4-seater plane. I can sit him far enough away from me and he'll be strapped in safely so he can't get out of the seat. I can sit him far enough away from me that he can't reach me if he tries to pull my hair. I can actually put him in a position behind the seat so he won't see the lights necessarily. I can take him just by riding around the air thing without taking off. So he can be in the plane and drive around the airport for half an hour if you like. He said, I'd love to do it. I'd love to do it, the pilot said. And they contacted me and they said, can we take this young man up in an airplane? Well, you can imagine, I'm in the court straight away with the plane having crashed, 4 lives gone, my career's gone, everything is bad. And then I said to them, what's your risk assessment? Because we've all been trained to think positively. They told me what the pilot had said about this. I said, okay, I want you to get that all in writing. I want you to write it down. Clearly, we know that pilot's certified. We need to check that he's a proper pilot with everything, and that the plane has been signed off as engineeringly okay to fly. Yes, let's take the risk. So off he went, and they drove around without taking off. And the pilot said, if I take off, the most it'll be is 5 minutes to coming back and landing. I'm not going off away from the airfield. They took off. This young man never bothered with the lights. He never tried to grab them. He just sat in the seat, laughing and smiling the whole time, looking out of the windows. Absolutely fabulous. And they were actually up for about 10 minutes, and he really, really loved it. And he didn't want to get out of the plane. Now, if we hadn't had a risk assessment process, he'd have never had that life opportunity. And you know what? Where he lived, close by, was a small airport. So when he came back from his holiday, we built it into his person-centered plan that he was going to go every month flying. So he was able to go every month and love going up in the aeroplanes, which 10 years before that could not have happened. So these are real life illustrations about how we can bring those risks down. So everything the pilot explained brought the risk down, brought the risk down, brought the risk down, until we got to something we could all be comfortable with. Just quickly, I've got an example here of a risk assessment form. So here we have behaviours. This is specifically looking at people's behaviours, because people with autism spectrum conditions and some other disabilities can often have a range of behaviours which can create risk. So we actually write the behaviours down in this column. What we want to know is how often that happens, or if it doesn't happen very often, when was the last time that it happened? Okay, was it 4 years ago? Was it 2 years ago? Was it last month? Was it yesterday? So that will tell us how likely it is. Then we look at who can be affected by those things happening. Public, visitors, staff, peers, self. We look at who can be affected by that. Then we move on to look at the next part, which is the hazards that come from that behaviour. Now, if we take the young man in the aeroplane as an example, on the first one would have been that he pulls hairs. It would also have been that he's aversive to lights. So in that situation, you would say, well, a hazard is he might pull the hair, or he might try and smash the lights on the aeroplane. And then we look at any other previous hazardous events. Well, of course, we know that he may pull people's hair. He may do things like so. That would go in. And then what are we going to do to actually reduce that risk? What are the benefits to the individual of reducing that risk? Well, clearly we could see with the case of the aeroplane that there were huge benefits to this young man in terms of life experience if we could allow him to take the risk, if we could allow ourselves, if you like, to take the risk of him doing it. So control measures that were put in place were a support plan, a protocol, pilot's advice that we know that the aircraft is safe, we know the pilot is trustworthy, we've seen all the documents and ticked those boxes, we've covered our backs, if you like, and allowing him to take the risk. So you can see how the process works, that we actually acknowledge the risks, we reduce the risks with information and knowledge, and then that enables us to allow things to happen and to allow us as professionals to allow people to take risks and to support them in taking risks safely and positively. So this is all about positive risk taking. If you're going to empower people, if you're going to promote self-advocacy, if you're going to promote person-centered planning, you also have to promote positive risk taking.